But since many agree with the opinion set forth above, believing that it was the opinion of Aristotle, it must be shown from his words that he himself did not feel this about the active intellect, that it is a separate substance. For he says first, that as in every nature there is something like matter in every kind, and this is in power to all things of that kind. And the second cause is, as it were, efficient, because it makes all things of that kind. As art has to matter, it is necessary that these differences also exist in the soul. And indeed of this kind, that is, what is in the soul as matter, is the possible intellect, in which all things become intelligible. But that which is in the soul as an efficient cause is the intellect in which it is to do all things, of course intelligible in act, that is, the active intellect, which is like a habit and not like a power. Now how he said that the intellect was active he explains by adding that it is like light, for in a certain way light causes colors to be actually colors, namely, inasmuch as it actually makes them visible. From these it is evidently held that the active intellect is not a separate substance, but rather something of the soul. For he expressly says that the possible and active intellect are the differences of the soul, and that they are in the soul. Therefore, neither of them is a separate substance. Still, his account shows the same thing. Because in every nature in which power and act are found, there is something like matter, which is in power to things of that kind, and something like an agent which reduces power into act, just as there is art and matter in artificial things. But the intellective soul is a kind of nature in which power and action are found, since sometimes it is actually intelligent and sometimes in potential. There is therefore in the nature of the intellectual soul something like matter, which is in power to all intelligible things, which is called the possible intellect, and something like an efficient cause, which does all things in actuality, and is called the active intellect. Both intellects, therefore, according to Aristotle's demonstration, are in the nature of the soul, and not something separate in being from the body of which the soul is the act. Further, Aristotle says that the active intellect is like the habitus, which is the light. But habit is not signified as something existing in itself, but as having something. Therefore, the active intellect is not some substance existing separately by itself, but is something of the human soul. But Aristotle's letter is not understood to mean that habitus is said to be the effect of the agent's intellect, so that it is sense. The agent makes a man understand everything, which is like a habitus. For this is the definition of a habit, as the commentator Averroes says there, that he who has a habit understands by it what is proper to him from himself and when he wills, without the fact that he needs something external in it. For he expressly likens to a habit not the deed itself, but the understanding by which it is to do all things. Nor is it to be understood that the active intellect is a habit in the manner in which the habit is in the second kind of quality, according to which some have said that the active intellect is the habit of principles, because that habit of principles is accepted by sensibles, as Aristotle proves in 2 of the latter. And so it must be the effect of the intellect of the agent, whose phantasms, which are understood in potential, make them understood in act. But habitus is understood according to what is divided against privation and power, just as every form and act can be called habitus. And this is evident because he says that in this way the active understanding was held as light was held. Then he adds that this intellect, that is the agent, is separate and unmixed and impassive, and actually being a substance. Now of these 4 which he attributed to the agent intellect, he had above expressly said 2 of the possible intellect, namely, that it should be mixed and that it should be separated. The third, namely, that it is impassible, he had said under distinction, For he shows first that it is not impassible like sense, and afterwards he shows that by accepting it in common it is susceptible, namely, inasmuch as it is in the power of the intelligible. The fourth, however, he had completely denied about possible understanding, saying that it was in the potential for intelligibles, and none of these things was actually before understanding. Thus then, in the first two, the possible understanding agrees with the agent. In the third, it partly agrees and partly differs. But in the fourth, the agent is completely different from the possible. He proves these four conditions of the agent by one reason: subordinating them. For the agent is always more honorable than the patient, and the principle, that is, the active, the material. For he had said above that the active intellect is like an efficient cause, and possible like matter. By means of this means the first two are concluded. Thus, the agent is more honorable than the patient and the matter. But the possible, which is like the patient and the matter, is separated and mixed, as was proved above. Therefore he is much more active. Others, however, are concluded by means of this means: the agent in this is more honorable than the patient and matter, which is compared to him as an agent and actual being to the patient and potential being. But the understanding is possible in a way that is patient and potentially being. Therefore, the understanding agent is an agent that does not suffer and is actually being. Now, it is clear that even from these words of Aristotle, it cannot be inferred that the active intellect is a kind of separate substance, but that it is separated in the way he said above about the possible, namely that it has no organ. Then he adds, now the same is the same according to the act of knowledge of the matter, in which the commentator says that the active intellect differs from the possible. For in the active intellect, the intellect and the intellect are the same, but not in the possible. But this is manifestly contrary to the intention of Aristotle, for above he had said the same words about the possible understanding, where he said about the possible understanding that it is itself intelligible like intelligibles. For in things that are without matter, the understanding is the same as what is understood. For speculative science and what has been speculated are the same. For he manifestly wants to show that the possible intellect, as it actually understands, is the same as that which is understood, that the possible intellect is understood like other intelligible things. And a little above he had said that the possible intellect is a power intelligible in a way. But there is nothing actually until it understands, where he expressly gives to understand that through what he actually understands, he himself becomes intelligible. Nor is it surprising that he says this about the possible understanding, because he also said this above about the sense, and the sensible according to the act. For the sense is actually made by the species sensed in the act, and in the same way the possible intellect becomes actually through an actually intelligible species. And for this reason, the intellect in act is called itself intelligible in act. It must therefore be said that after Aristotle had determined about the possible and active intellect, he begins here to determine about the intellect in act, saying that knowledge in act is the same as the thing known in act. Then he says, he who, according to power, is prior in time in one, but absolutely not in time. Indeed, he uses this distinction between power and act in several places, namely, that act according to nature is prior to power. But in time, in one and the same thing, that which is changed from potential to act is the potential prior to the act. But simply speaking, there is no power even in time prior to the act, because power is not reduced to an act except through an act. He says, therefore, that the intellect which is according to power, that is possible as it is in power, is prior in time to the intellect in act, and this I say in one and the same. Not at all, however, that is universally, because the possible intellect is reduced to an act by the active intellect, which is actually as he said, and again by some possible intellect made actually, whence he said in phys. Thus, therefore, in these words he shows the order of the possible understanding as it is in potential to the actual understanding. Then he says, but sometimes he does not really understand, and sometimes he does not understand, in which he shows the difference between actual understanding and possible understanding. For he said above of the possible understanding that he does not always understand, but sometimes he does not understand, when he is in the power of intelligible things. Sometimes she understands, that is, when she is actually herself, but the understanding takes place through this act, which is itself intelligible, as he has already said. Hence it is not proper for him sometimes to understand, and sometimes not to understand. Then he adds, but this alone is truly separate. This cannot be understood of the agent, for he alone is not separated, because he had already said the same about possible understanding. Nor can it be understood of the possible, because he had already said the same of the agent. It is left then to be said of that which includes both, namely, of the intellect in act, of which he spoke, because this alone is separated in our soul, not using the organ which belongs to the intellect in act, that is, that part of the soul which we actually understand, including the possible and the active, and therefore he adds that this alone of the soul is immortal and eternal, as if not dependent on the body, since it is separate.